I've been studying environmental justice for quite a while, and I've only been in Australia for the last, 2+ years. And so it's been interesting for me to start to think about what environmental justice means in the Australian context and how it differs, or actually resembles now, unfortunately, a lot of what's going on in the US. Environmental justice has been one of the central organizing discourses of environmental and climate movements globally over the last 30 years. In that time, movements using environmental justice as an organizing theme have really challenged some key ideas and broadly expanded the concept of both environment and justice. So I want to talk this evening a little bit about that evolving definition of environmental justice, the evolving definitions of both environment and justice. But I also want to focus on what I see as this important context of Australia, especially around resource mining and climate change. And while environmental justice hasn't really been an organizing principle or movement in Australia in the past, there are now, again, unfortunately, a lot more applications of the concept here, and it's growing in importance, it's growing as a discourse, especially among youth, around climate change and climate justice. I think what's interesting is that what's happening now in Australia really fits with the way that environmental justice as a concept has evolved elsewhere. So I want to start by talking about how the concept of environmental justice has expanded a number of simple boundaries. So the idea of environmental justice in the US, again, challenged both of the terms that make up the name, the idea of environment, the concept of environment, and the concept of justice. So let me take these one at a time. So as for the first, the idea of the environment of environmental justice was conceived in the US very differently from what had been the traditional concern of environmental movements. And one of the things that I find interesting here, as well as in the US, is this is just taken for granted now. It used to be that environment was the wilderness. It was the wild, it was the outside, it was the rivers, it was the forests. It was all of that stuff that's not here. It was over there. And it took a while, and I think it took the influence of the environmental justice movement to focus on, as the slogan of the environmental justice movement goes, on environment as where we live, work, and play. An environment is this room, environment is our interactions with nature on this campus, it's the quality of the air that we're breathing, and it was really a shift over the past 20 or 30 years. And the thing that, for me, is kind of interesting now is when you say this to young students, they say, yeah, so what? Of course, that's what environment means. Environment is our everyday interaction with the nature that sustains us. So to me, that's progress. Nature, environment isn't just something that's over there. It is this relationship, really. It is this immersion where we are. So environmental justice activists in the US wanted to bring attention to the conditions in which people were constantly and physically immersed in their everyday lives. Industrial smokestacks and waste dumps in neighborhoods, lead poisoning and uranium contamination in the blood of African American and Native American kids, and also communities obviously impacted by coal mining or threatened by fracking. This was every much part of environmental concerns than wilderness and the big outside. And I have to say that I think that adoption came a little later here, but in a really different way. So I came here, the first time I came to Australia was 1997. It was, oddly enough, the first global conference on environmental justice held in Melbourne in 1997. And I have to say, my immediate reaction was that Australians really didn't get what environmental justice was about, because the makeup of the conference was this bizarre mix of imported American academics talking about environmental racism and deep ecologists. They even flew in Arne Næss, the god of deep ecology from Norway, who is a wilderness advocate. And so they were trying to mix these different things up, but they weren't really integrating them. And so 20 years ago, I thought, wow, the Aussies just don't get it. They don't get what environmental justice is about because they're still trying to make it about this. But now, looking back, almost 20 years later, I think Australia was way ahead of the game. You know, it's usually, oh, it'll hit Australia 10 years later, but this time it was, you guys were ahead of the game. And environmental justice in the US and elsewhere slowly come around to thinking not just about environmental impacts on human beings, but also about human impacts on the environment and just what it means to be human beings immersed in and dependent on the ecosystems that we are surrounded by and supported by. So this shift to a concern for nature and ecosystems, well, it did exist a little bit at the beginning of the environmental justice movement in the US, right? So because of the influence of Native Americans. So the very first principle of environmental justice, and this was developed at a conference on the first National People of Color Environmental Leadership Summit in the US, say that time and time again in lectures. And the first principle of environmental justice is that environmental justice affirms the sacredness of Mother Earth, ecological unity, and the interdependence of all species and the right to be free of ecological destruction. Now, most of the people who were at this environmental justice summit in 1991 were urban African Americans, and I can assure you that the vast majority of them had never met a Native American before, had never thought about Mother Earth other than in videos. But through just talking with people, there's some really interesting stuff written about this conference, the interchange of ideas, the respect given to Native Americans. There it was, the very first principle of environmental justice, and that list of 17 principles has really run through the movement for the past 30 years. But since then, after that, there really wasn't much, especially in the African American community, until Katrina. And Katrina brought about a shift in the understanding of what environment is in the environmental justice community in the US. So before Katrina, there was a big environmental justice focus on that area of land between Baton Rouge and New Orleans, dubbed Cancer Alley. Cancer Alley is where there are oil refineries and vinyl manufacturing plants and chemical plants, and it was all about the stuff coming out of the stacks and falling on the local communities. It was the fence line communities that were impacted. And that was what environmental justice in New Orleans was all about. And then Katrina hit. And not quite overnight, but pretty quickly, there became this shift. It wasn't just about what was going up the stacks and coming down and affecting the communities. It was about what was coming out of the stacks, impacting the atmosphere, changing the climatic system, heating up the Gulf of Mexico, causing stronger storms that then came into the already vulnerable community and devastated it. And there was this awakening to nature, to these larger ecological flows, to a broader conception of the relationship between human and environment. And there's some phenomenal work that's been done post-Katrina by Beverly Wright and Bob Bullard about the environmental justice implications of Katrina. So there's been this link made between ecological stability and the functioning of the community. And I think there are two important points to this shift. First, it really did help turn environmental justice, and then Sandy hit New York, right? And so it's really helped push environmental justice activists in the US towards thinking about a different relationship with nature and the climate system. Things like the importance of native plants in the Delta and how they protect from storm surges. Now, in Australia, the environmental focus was always on nature, right? It remained on forests and rivers and the like. And it's been these movements that we're talking about tonight on coal and coal seam gas that have really pushed the traditional environmental community to address environments in which people live. And that's why you finally have environmental organizations, Greenpeace, Friends of the Earth, EDO, and others, working in alliances with farmers, right? Why you have farmers and rural organizations giving up their long-standing distrust of environmental organizations that were only focused on preservation and conservation and not on the relationship between humans and environments in place. People who saw greenies as the enemy and not as potential collaborators. And it's only because they've come to some new understandings of the environments in which we do live, work, and play, not just wilderness, but where our lives and our cultures are immersed. Okay, so that's the environmental side of environmental justice, and then there's the justice side. So justice is usually conceived of as inequality, right? And the very beginning of the environmental justice movement in the US was all about African American communities, minority communities, poor communities getting dumped on more than anybody else, right? Getting more risks than other people. It was inequity, right? We get more than others. And that really hasn't been as much of an issue here. But what happened in the US is that, well, except for indigenous communities, of course, but what happened in the US is that the focus immediately evolved past just a focus on equity to things like racism, lack of recognition, a cultural disrespect for African American communities, for indigenous communities, that risks were being put specifically on disempowered communities. So there was a politics of recognition, of discrimination, of disrespect, and stereotypes. And then the focus was also on the exclusion that came with inequity and disrespect. There's a concern with participation. Another one of the slogans of the environmental justice movement in the US has always been, we speak for ourselves, or we want a seat at the table. It's always been about participation and voice, to be where projects are reviewed and decisions made. And then more than that, justice became an issue of the very functioning of communities, the health of communities, the way that communities work. It's about health and jobs and clean air and water and the basic needs of everyday life and the environmental threats to those needs. And again, I think there's this evolution in thinking in the Australian context. Now, I have to admit that I haven't looked very much at the empirical evidence about inequity in Australia. There's obviously inequity when it comes to the distribution of environmental risk in Aboriginal communities. But it hasn't really been an organizing principle in environmental movements here. But issues of recognition and participation, and especially, and now, with these movements, the functioning of communities and the functioning of cultures, those have been part of the conceptualization of justice. So movements responding to coal and coal seam gas mining refer to their lack of recognition. People feel as though their agency as citizens has been taken away. They argue and they feel as though they're valued less than the stuff that we dig out of the ground. And their ways of life are devalued. So you have these long-standing, iconic ideals of farming in one of the most lush and productive areas of the country. And that culture is being dismissed as antiquated or underproductive in the face of the resource boom. And that dismissal, that lack of recognition, that lack of standing has meant that their participation in the governance of their own communities is being taken away. And so the idea is that governments of New South Wales, and I say that in the plural purposely, haven't been listening. They haven't been responding to citizens. Right? They argue that the governments are in the pocket, sometimes literally, well, not literally, okay, really figuratively, the pocket of mining companies. Worse, these governments have been creating barriers to public participation, defunding organizations like EDO that help communities to participate in the political and the legal processes. So procedural justice has been a major demand and part of the discourse of justice. Again, it's not just about inequity. But most importantly, and I think most saliently, the injustice is seen in the way that the very functioning of communities is being undermined. Right? So there's been a long-standing focus on health in the US. And so you have movements in Harlem, for example. We Act in Harlem, I was just talking to my class about this morning, working on air pollution, so either incinerators or bus depots, and that's been impacting the health of the community. But it's not just about individual kids. It's about the health of the entire community. It's about the community's ability to function. The same with lead poisoning, which leads to all kinds of issues. So here, it's harder to find a more salient example than the threat to water, right? Water of a farming community. And I don't want to get into an argument about the geology of fracking, but you know, when you're blowing things up underground and you're punching through rock, you do punch right into water tables. And if you're punching through rock with chemicals, you shouldn't really be surprised when those chemicals start showing up in the water supply. So again, we shouldn't be surprised when we have farming communities and grape growers and horse breeders all dependent on water, worried about the way that coal seam gas mining might quite simply contaminate the key element that makes their way of life, their livelihoods, their cultures possible. And I think these movements that we're talking about today and tomorrow illustrate the evolution of this thinking on justice as well. And one more point. I think there's another important shift, not just in environment and not just in justice, but in the understanding of the relationship between the two. And this is crucial, because what we've seen in the last 20 years is a move in the understanding of the relationship between environment and justice. It used to be that movements saw poor environmental conditions as a symptom of social injustice. So if you were screwed one way, you were screwed lots of ways, including on the environment. It was just another example of how poorly you were treated as a community. But what's happened is that there's been this shift to where a functioning environment now is seen to create the underlying conditions for any situation of justice. So it's not just a symptom. Environment isn't just a symptom. Environment is what is needed. A functioning environment is what is needed to have any sort of justice. And again, that's what happened after Katrina in the US, that's what happened after Sandy, and that's what's happening here. So farmers get this relationship. That's why farmers are some of the most outspoken critics of coal and coal seam gas mining that threatens a long-standing way of life. That's why we have elderly women who want their grandkids to continue their culture and their traditions protesting in front of the New South Wales Parliament. So I think Australian activists and the movements we'll hear about tonight and tomorrow are at the forefront of this challenge of our conception of environmental justice and our treatment of the environments in which our everyday lives are immersed and under which and in which we all depend. Thanks.